Welcome to the Body First Healing Podcast. I'm Britt Piper, survivor turned somatic experiencing practitioner and author. If you feel stuck in old patterns, overwhelmed by your emotions, or disconnected from yourself, you're in the right place. Each week, I'll share practical somatic tools, personal stories, and conversations to support you in building a more regulated and embodied life. Because you can't talk your way through healing, you have to feel your way through. Together, we'll explore what it means to come back to yourself and create a life that feels safe enough to fully live in. I am so glad that you're here. Hello, and welcome back to the Body First Healing Podcast. I am your host, Britt Piper, somatic experiencing practitioner, survivor, author, and speaker. And today's conversation is, I feel like, a topic that not only has impacted me personally, but it's also something that I see a lot of within my practice. A lot of my clients come in with burnout. And this is something that perhaps you've experienced either in your work, either in motherhood, or just this modern world that we live in general. So today's conversation is going to be a much deeper dive, a more nuanced approach into the topic of burnout. And I think the conversation today might surprise some people because I'm going to go a different direction than we typically go. We're not going to talk about how to strategize and structure your routines to get the most out of your day. We're not going to talk about self-care. We're going to talk about burnout from a bit of a different perspective today. How we can actually look at burnout as a blessing in disguise, as a way for us to come to know our boundaries more, and redirection when we don't feel aligned or on the right path. All right, guys, so let's get right into it. So first of all, I'm going to start with a question. What if I told you that burnout isn't actually a productivity problem, and it's instead your nervous system trying to save your life? I know that sounds really dramatic and really bold, but burnout is an epidemic, and it's also a blessing because it gives us redirection and it shows us where we've potentially betrayed our boundaries or where we've crossed our boundaries. And so for me, as a personal anchor, I've talked so much about being this recovering workaholic and this overachiever, and I've been through this cycle myself. Burnout forced me back into alignment, potentially not back into it, but into alignment for the first time in my life. And I feel like burnout was beautiful because it actually showed me the doorway to healing. And we talk a lot in the somatic space about how healing really happens when we slow down. And burnout, I feel like, is one of those ways where your body just forces you to slow down. It forces you to realign. And so from my perspective, burnout, even though it's really uncomfortable, has been this opportunity to slow down in life and to get really clear on what are my boundaries, first of all? How can I realign to them? How can I set a pace and a structure in my life that feels authentic, that feels manageable, that feels good and fulfilling? So today we're going to talk all things burnout. We're going to discuss what burnout really is, why women experience burnout more than men, how burnout can actually be a blessing in our life and how we can really take advantage of that season, and how our cultural conditioning really sets women up for these seasons of burnout. And then, of course, we're going to end it out with some somatic insights. I'm going to give you lots of wonderful somatic practices and just some guidance that you can use to actually take advantage of this season of burnout and look at it as redirection and not rejection in your life. All right, my friends, so let's get into it. So first of all, what is burnout? Now, I think that there are two lenses that we can really view and discuss and explore burnout today. So the first lens is going to be more of the physiological lens, and then the second is going to be more of the personal lens. So according to the World Health Organization, burnout can be defined as exhaustion from chronic workplace stress. And really what we're talking about here is nervous system dysregulation and depletion. Okay, it's when we are running on fumes because of chronic stress. And I just want to reference here, it's not always about workplace stress. sometimes we can have stress in our relationships, in our parenting, and just in this modern world that we live in general. So it doesn't always have to come from workplace stress. But from a physiological nervous system lens, I'm going to walk you through just the quick science of what burnout is. And this is something that we call an autonomic loop in the polyvagal space. So if you've listened to some of my recent episodes, I've talked about the polyvagal ladder or the nervous system ladder. And this ladder has 3 different sections. At the very top, you have rest and digest, your ventral vagal state. In the middle of the ladder, you have your sympathetic state of fight or flight. This is your mobilizing state where you have adrenaline and cortisol to propel you. And then down at the bottom of the nervous system ladder is your dorsal vagal state, otherwise known as your shutdown state. And this is kind of your state, not of mobilization like fight or flight, but immobilization. Here is where the body goes into conservation mode, hibernation mode. Now, another analogy that people really love to use from the polyvagal world is that the nervous system is like a car, right? Gas pedal, brake pedal. When you're in sympathetic, that fight or flight mobilizing response, it's like your foot is on the gas pedal. And that's the adrenaline and cortisol that mobilizes you and gives you that pick me up, right? That get up and go. Now, the opposite is your dorsal state. And this is not the gas pedal, but the brake pedal. So imagine your autonomic loop like this. You are in sympathetic fight or flight, and you have your foot on the pedal, but you are pedal to the metal. Okay, you are not taking time to slow down in your life, to rest, to recover, to repair. And so what happens over time is that your nervous system becomes depleted. You are running on E. And so you end up down at the bottom, down in dorsal, right? And so this is where that brake pedal really kind of comes in because we are out of gas. Now, what I see time and time again with burnout is that people will go in fight or flight. And the chronic flight response is more so that workaholic, that overachiever, the person that goes and goes and goes. And really, it's a form of escapism for a lot of people, right? We can use our work as a way to escape some of the hard things of our past. And I know that for me, that was certainly a pattern that was taught early on. It's a pattern that was passed down from a lot of the women in my family and my generational line. Now, it's important to say here that the nervous system is meant to have short spurts of adrenaline and cortisol, but we're not meant to live in these states. In previous episodes, I've talked about how a regulated nervous system is one that goes up and down that nervous system ladder roughly 100 times a day without getting stuck. And so there are going to be moments where we come down into fight or flight or into dorsal for a moment of rest and reprieve, but we are not meant to live here. We are not meant to stay here with these chronic stress hormones. So when we are in those states of stress for extended periods of time, that turns into chronic stress. Okay, so we go down into that state of rest and repair, conservation, and it can feel really exhausting to be down here, right? We feel drained. And so what we see often, and what I see a lot in the Body First Healing program when I'm working with clients, is that they come in and they feel either emotionally or physically exhausted or both. And it's likely because they've been living in these states of chronic stress and their body and their nervous system just cannot sustain it. So just to reiterate, that burnout loop is where we have an overdrive of sympathetic activation, which then leads us into this crash in dorsal and then repeat. Now, coming back to this theme of this personal lens where we can feel like we are emotionally burnt out, where we are not living from this place of vitality, aliveness, and life force. You know, that can happen when we're living a life that doesn't feel like ours. And the most exhausting thing that I can think of is wearing a mask, carrying a facade, pretending to be someone that we're not, or living a life that doesn't feel aligned with who we really are. When we are disconnected from our true selves, there are parts of us that we have to suppress, that we have to push down. And it takes an incredible amount of energy to do that, and it can become exhausting. And so from this perspective, we burn out when we don't authentically express how we feel, who we are, or how we want to show up in this world and in this life. And this kind of takes me into my next point, which is why I feel like burnout, especially for women, is so prevalent in comparison to men. And the research shows this across the board. 55% of women will experience burnout compared to 42% of men. And this is according to the American Medical Association. I think this has a lot to do with the self-silencing that women do. Self-silencing is a term that was coined by a Harvard professor where they explored this correlation of women silencing their needs to prioritize others and the negative impact that that had on their health later on in life. And essentially what we're talking about is that over time, when we are silencing our own needs as women, either because we are tending to our children, we're tending to our partners, we're trying to show up in our job, and we're also trying to show up for ourselves, we become exhausted. And that life force gets extinguished. I think this also plays into the higher rates that women experience things like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, digestive issues. There is an autoimmune epidemic that is happening to women. And this really started in the mid to late 90s. And I think that we need to start exploring that. I was listening to a recent podcast with Zach Bush, and I'm going to drop this in the show notes. But he was talking about how when a woman marries a man, her life expectancy goes down by 4 to 6 years. And when a man marries a woman, his life expectancy goes up by 2 years. And so ultimately, I think this all comes back around to this theme that women are carrying so much of the mental, emotional load of this world that we live in. We are showing up for others before ourselves. And there's that one saying that just because we carry it well doesn't mean it's not heavy, right? Over time, carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders, it's going to deplete us. It's going to exhaust us. And so I think that as a society, we need to become better about setting up these realistic expectations for women. And I think this also has to come back to this recognition of what the feminist movement did for women. In so many ways, it supported us in feeling liberated and feeling like we had equality and feeling like we had rights. However, and I'm saying this as someone with a background in women's studies, okay? I have a background in women's studies. I just want to say that. However, women are different from men biologically in many ways. And so I feel like we have been set to this patriarchal pace or standard that women realistically and sustainably cannot carry. There is a biological mismatch because men have a 24-hour cycle, whereas women have a 28-day cycle. And this is such an important part of the conversation that I feel like unfortunately is getting left out when we're talking about burnout and the pressure that women are under today in business, in the home, in motherhood. Our cycle is this natural rhythm that ebbs and flows. And although I'm an entrepreneur, I run multiple businesses, grind culture is not healthy. It's not sustainable for women. And it is biologically out of touch. And I will say that personally for me, as an entrepreneur, as a mother, as a female who has come from a long, long line of very successful women, if you've read my book, you know, I talk about the interviews that I did with my grandmother and my mother and my aunt, and how we are all these very independent, financially successful women. And even my grandmother, she knew Gloria Steinem. She was a part of the founding women's movement. And so it's a part of my heritage that I am so, so proud of. And it's a part of my resilience and what makes me me today. However, it wasn't until I experienced burnout when I became a mother and I was running all of these businesses that I realized that I was living at a pace that was not my own. And I was not living at the rhythm of my body, not just my body in this 28-day rhythm, but also who I am inherently as a person. I am someone who authentically craves slowness. I am someone who works hard and wants to rest hard. And because I was so disconnected from myself, because I was muscling through, because I was just kind of sticking to the script of this is what you do as a fearless woman who wants to take up space in the world and it's important to be independent, I didn't slow down enough to listen to my body and to listen to myself and to know like, actually, this is not sustainable and you've been pushing past your boundaries. And now we need to get really clear on what an aligned and balanced life looks like. So for me, cycle syncing has actually been a really beautiful like awakening and this learning moment for me in my journey, not just as a recovering workaholic, but also as a menstruating woman. And it's interesting because you think that like knowing about our cycle is something that all women know. And what I have found is that so many of us do not know about our cycle and our phases. And so let's just walk through it really quickly. So first of all, you have 4 phases, okay? You have your menstrual phase, which is day 1 to 5 of your cycle. Okay, this is when you have the lowest hormones. This is where things like rest, reflection, gentle movement can feel really supportive and nourishing to the body. The second phase is going to be your follicular phase, and this is days 6 through 13. Okay, this is where we have a rise in estrogen. So we have a lot more energy, creativity. This is where we can brainstorm better. The third phase is going to be your ovulatory phase. And this is where we ovulate in days 14 through 17. And this is where we have our peak in hormones. And of course, this is where the highest chances of conception can happen. So here is where you want to prioritize being social. Here is where we like to be really expressive and where we can have really high output in our work. And then the last phase, which I've really been learning more about, and I recently talked about the luteal phase in a recent Q&A, so go back and listen to that episode. But the luteal phase is day 18 through roughly day 28. And this is where our progesterone rises. Here we have slower energy. Here it can be really important to really ground, to rest, to conserve energy. And a reframe that I have recently had around the luteal phase is that it's not a phase of dysfunction, right? Where like PMS and we're bloating and we feel so lethargic and exhausted and oh my gosh, I'm just in a bad mood and migraines, all these things. It's not a phase of dysfunction. It is a descent. It's a descent because your body is doing so much work, right? It's preparing the lining for it to be shed. And so here is where we just really need to let the body take center stage. We need to let it take the lead and focus more on the internal stuff that's happening, the internal work, rather than doing all of this external work. So that's why we really want to conserve energy in the luteal phase. Now, when we have dysregulated cycles that feel really high, really low, our hormones feel all out of whack, we're really irritable, we're PMSing a lot, that can often be a reflection or a mirror of a nervous system that doesn't feel safe enough to soften. And a lot of this learning that I have been talking about around, my cycle and what that has to do with overworking has really been happening here around this concept of feeling safe enough to soften, safe enough to rest, safe enough to relax. And so when we're living in a culture or in a world that, again, biologically is a mismatch to our natural rhythm, right? When we're living in a world that doesn't allow us to soften, then what that really means is we are working against our bodies. We are working against ourselves. So of course we end up in burnout. Now, what I've been doing instead is I have been getting really into cycle syncing. There's an incredible book out there called Woman Code, but essentially cycle syncing is essentially creating or curating a lifestyle and a life that really aligns with all of the different phases of your cycle. So whether it's the food that you're eating, whether it's the kind of movement that you're doing, whether it's your work output. So for me, I have really leaned into downshifting. Like in my luteal phase, that means lighter workouts, not doing heavy lifting, really prioritizing rest, trying not to have big lunches in my businesses around my luteal phase. And that also goes back to like my morning routine. So when I'm in my luteal phase or my menstrual phase, this is where I am going to sleep in a little bit more. My alarm clock's not going to go off at 5 a.m. So here I am prioritizing rest. I am prioritizing repair for my body and just really giving it all of the tender space that it needs to do all of that internal work that's happening. And then also taking advantage of the other beautiful phases as well. So In my follicular phase is where I'm going to feel like I should really be doing some brainstorming meetings or having more collaborative meetings with people because I feel super creative and engaged in the work. So when we're working with our body, that means that we are not depleting ourselves. So it's always going to be so much more beneficial to work with your body rather than against it. We often talk about feeling safe enough to rest, right? I feel safe to rest. I feel safe enough to slow down. And I think that we use that word safe because we're taught that slowing down means that we're failing. But failure comes more so when we force things, when we force past our boundaries, when we force ourselves to do something that we don't want to, when we force ourselves to follow routines that actually are depleting us. When we force, that leads to failure. But when we lean into flexibility, which again are those ebbs and flows of our phases and our cycles, rather than force, then that flexibility can really honor the cycles. And this is where we lean into working hard and resting hard, right? Not forcing our way through, not armoring through life. And it's important to really recognize just how important rest is. You know, I shouldn't have to say that rest is productive for us to be drawn to it, but it's true. It is productive. When we stay in those states of homeostasis, when we have a healthy stress response cycle, it goes through a cycle of stress and back to neutral, and stress and activated and back to neutral. And so those moments where we're in seasons of rest and repair are incredibly productive for our overall well-being, for us to be resilient, and for us to feel like we have energy that really sustains us. And when we talk about being relaxed, the word relaxed, actually, the Old English translation is to be released. And when we talk about the releasing here, we're talking about the liberation, the releasing ourselves from this pressure to show up, to do everything. And so living from a place of relaxation or a place of ease, a place of ebbs and flows in this rhythm that I'm talking about really is not that we need to feel safe to rest. It's that we feel free and liberated enough to rest. We feel free to feel into what feels important to us and authentic to us rather than forcing something that's not. We feel free to choose how we want to show up and live our lives. And so when it comes to burnout culture, in particular, how it relates to women, menstruating women, I think that a lot of this is about reclaiming, right? Reclaiming ourselves, reclaiming that natural rhythm. And now, before I get into some somatic roadmaps and just some gentle tips of things that you can start to do to not live from a place of burnout, but live from a place of alignment and capacity, is I want to talk about this concept that burnout can actually be viewed as a blessing. When I think about my own seasons of burnout, I really look at those moments in my life as redirection. I always say rejection is just protection. Rejection is just redirection. There were times in my life where my nervous system and my body just could not keep up with a pace that was too fast. And I was forced to slow down. And at the time, it was, of course, very inconvenient, very uncomfortable. And it meant that I had to rearrange my life. But looking back now, I am so grateful that that happened, because it showed me where I had betrayed my boundaries. And by the way, we often don't know what our boundaries are until we've crossed them. And I think the beautiful thing about the season of burnout is that it forces you to slow down, to recognize that your capacity is not what you thought it was. And it gives you the space and the time to really realign your life in a way that feels manageable, in a way that feels good, in a way that feels fulfilling and not depleting. And so for a lot of us too, who maybe never knew that we had boundaries, it teaches us those boundaries if we never identified them in the first place. And then maybe an even more controversial hot take here is that as you step into healing work, especially somatic healing work, it should almost sometimes be expected that you are going to experience moments of burnout. You should burn out when you begin to heal because it reveals to you where repair is needed. So for me, burnout stripped away the mask of who I thought I needed to be, and it forced me to return to that authentic self. But burnout for some people is going to allow them to become much more embodied, much more somatically aware of what their capacity is. And it's not going to allow you to force through or push through as you used to. It's not going to allow you to dissociate anymore and to armor up against life. Burnout is oftentimes a really brutal reckoning with your body's innate wisdom and capacity, and it is the quickest way back into your body. And although it's not comfortable for some people, it is the first wake-up call that they even have a body, right? When their body doesn't have that get up and go in the morning, when their body fails them, when their body says, I can't do it today, I need sleep, I'm in pain, this is excruciating, that is not sickness. That is a signal. That is your body talking to you and saying, I need you to listen. And so we can either look at that as a sign that we are broken, or we can look at it as a blessing. Oh my gosh, my body is speaking to me and I finally get the opportunity to listen. And so burnout really invites you to stop chasing milestones in life and to really return to the things that feel meaningful. And then I think to take it even deeper, oftentimes in that reckoning also comes so much meaning and so much self-awareness. So for me, as I've mentioned, I came from this lineage of very high-achieving women who I believed were taught that their worth was equated to how successful they were and that performance equals love. And I had to really confront those parts of me that recognize that, oh, my worth doesn't have to be measured by how much output I can show up with every day in my business and how much I can be successful on paper. My worth is internal. It's not earned. It can't be measured in a bank account or in a resume or in a number of followers. That stuff is not important. At the end of the day, what matters is, can I meet myself in moments of discomfort, in moments of rest, in moments of joy, in moments of excitement? Can I meet myself in every up and down, every peak and valley of my journey? That's what matters. Can I meet myself with love and acceptance, regardless of where I'm at in my life and in my professional world? I think that's also important to note when we talk about not forcing things in your life, but being flexible. It's also recognizing that there are some seasons in life where you do want to grind and where you do have that capacity. And then there are other seasons where the meaning changes and you find more meaning in the slowness, and that can be okay. But because I didn't know how to be flexible in my businesses and because I hadn't set boundaries for myself from the beginning, I was taught a really hard lesson. And I think what I've learned since that season of burnout from a few years ago is that it is your nervous system that sets the metronome to your home, that sets the pace. It is the metronome for not just your life, your health, your family, your business, your team, but you find that when you give yourself permission to slow down, others will adapt to that rhythm. And if they don't, then they're probably not meant to be a part of that next season of life for you. And that's okay. Let's just talk really quickly about how you can sustain or support yourself in seasons where you do have more of that vitality, more of that aliveness. And I specifically want to touch into kind of 3 different topics here. So first of all, vitality and aliveness. Vitality essentially is your life force, right? The things that bring you to life. And so you want to be resourced to meet life. And that means engaging in things that make you feel whole. not things that deplete from you. And that's going to be relationships. That's going to be the food that you eat. That's going to be the activities that you participate in. What are the things that build into your life? Think of it like going to the bank. What are the things that deposit into your bank and don't deplete, right? Don't withdraw and take away from what you're trying to build. The second principle that I would recommend focusing on is resonance. And resonance is the concept of harmony between your mind, your body, and your environment. And we've kind of spoken to this a little bit today, that you can be in a place where you're emotionally, mentally, personally not burnt out, but your physical body is burnt out, or vice versa. And so really trying to bring yourself into harmony between mind, body, environment, it means that you're taking more of this holistic approach to creating vitality in your life. And you're focusing on your mental health, you're focusing on your emotional resilience, you're also focusing on your physical body and the food that you eat and being mindful of that. And you're also focusing on your environment. So the people around you, your workplace environment, your home, these things are all important. And you can't just focus on one because they all impact one another. So it has to be a harmonious, holistic approach. And that's what resonance really means. And then the third principle here is more so this concept of wholeness and integration. And wholeness and integration is really like walking the walk, right? Not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, making sure that your values and the things that you authentically want, right? The things that feel meaningful to you, that you're actually making choices in your life that align with that. There's what we know we want. There's what we know our boundaries are. There's what we know our capacity is, but are we actually following through and integrating that into our everyday life? And so before I give you kind of the practical somatic roadmaps and tools, this here was just a bit of the formula of the opposite of burnout. And the opposite of that burnout is renewed capacity, right? Internal capacity, as well as cultivating an environment and a lifestyle where your nervous system feels safe enough to show up fully at any state on that ladder. Whether you're down in dorsal, whether you're in fight or flight, whether you're up in ventral, right? We move up and down, in and out of these ebbs and flows every single day. And it's about granting ourselves permission to slow down every now and then, to speed up when we need to, and knowing that it doesn't have to be permanent. Okay, so let's get into some practical roadmaps and some somatic tools that you can start to use in your life if you feel like you are in the thick of it, a season of burnout. So again, going back to that bank analogy, we really want to think of wholesome practices and wholesome experiences as deposits in the bank. The more that you fill yourself up, the more capacity you are going to be able to extend for yourself. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to get into the practice of pausing more and pushing less. And this kind of goes back to, again, the being more flexible and less forceful of yourself. But it's important, especially in seasons of burnout, when we've been going, and we feel really disconnected to ourselves, to slow down enough and to really look inward to track, what is my capacity in this moment? What is my authentic yes? What is my authentic no? Do I feel like this is something that I really want to do? Is this something that I don't want to do? And when we are able to just tap on the brakes a little bit or let go of the gas pedal, we can start to slow down and really hear ourselves more clearly. And so again, going back to the metronome, going back to setting the pace in your life, pausing rather than pushing forward is going to be really important. And some tangible ways that you can do this in your life, in your relationships, and even in your business is to start to show up in communication with people in the same kind of pace that you want to be communicated with. And let me share with you what I mean by that. So for instance, as a professional speaker, it is definitely a seasonal job. And there are some months every year where I know I am going to be on the road for most of this month, which means I'm going to have less capacity to get back to emails. So what I will typically do is I will set the pace for my responses early on in the month by setting up an automated email response that will say, "Hi there, I am on the road for my speaking tour. I'm so excited you're reaching out. It usually takes me, and then I might even say like 7 to 10 days to get back to you. If this is important, then please reach out to my assistant at blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what I'm doing is I am giving permission for myself to pause. I'm letting off the pressure, but I'm also letting other people know too that this is the pace, right? I am setting the metronome here. You could also do this in your texting and response times, right? Like you don't have to get back to someone right away. You can take your time. You can take your time to think things through, to make a decision. We don't have to force, we don't have to rush our way into things. And slowing down is going to allow ourselves to really sink into the knowing or the feeling of whether or not it feels like a yes or it feels like a no. So this takes me into now the next somatic practice or tool, and that's going to be really strengthening your ability to hear your interoceptive cues. I've talked about this before on the podcast, but your interoceptive cues are essentially the internal signals that your body is showing you all the time. And we typically don't listen to these signals, or we're not consciously aware of them. However, we are subconsciously aware of them. And that is done through this process called neuroception. But when we become consciously and intentionally aware of our interoceptive cues, what happens is that gives us an opportunity to really honor and show up for the body in the ways that it authentically needs. So some things that you can start to listen for is, what are your hunger cues? Like, how is your body showing you that you're hungry right now? How is your body showing you that you're full? How do you know that you're tired and that you're fatigued? How do you know that you have energy? How do you know that you want to say yes to that one thing? How do you know that you want to say no? Right? We start to lean into the impulses. We start to lean into the little micro movements that happen in the body, the way that the stomach clenches, the way that the stomach expands, the way that certain diaphragms hold, the way that our eyes will start to look down or start to look towards, the way that we lean forward in our posture, the way that we sit back, the way that we open our arms, the way that we close ourselves off. When you start to become an observer of your body, you are able to listen to it, to honor it, to be guided by its wisdom so much easier. So again, with the intention of trying to understand, what are my boundaries? If I've never known what my boundaries are, this is a really great first step. Okay, next, put rest and play on the to-do list. Again, work hard, rest hard. We want to be putting wholesome practices that fill up our tank into the bank. We don't just want to be depleting ourselves all the time. And one of the greatest ways to do that is through play, through co-regulation, through rest, through intimacy. These are important things, okay, that help your system to maintain that extended capacity and threshold to really allow ourselves to navigate and be with more in seasons when we need that. Now, this is going to take us into our boundaries, okay? As we start to get better at pausing over pushing, at listening to our body, at setting a slower pace, we are going to become more aware of what our boundaries are. And you can consider those to be your capacity lines. Okay, so we really want to start to identify, what are my boundaries? What is important to me? What does feel like it's within my capacity and my threshold, and what doesn't? And in moments where you feel like you're past your capacity, I want you to start to practice, and I know this is easier said than done, asking for help. Asking for help. And again, this goes back to the whole self-silencing that women do, but it's important to remember that we are social creatures. Connection is something that was hardwired into our nervous system. Our nervous system prioritizes social engagement as a means for our survival. When we are in community, when we're in connection, when we are in tribe, that means that we have a higher chance, a higher likelihood of survival. Your body and your nervous system want you to be in connection with other people. But we often don't reach out or ask for help because we feel like it's this sign of weakness. But if you think about it, more often than not, it takes more strength to reach out than to pretend that you're actually fine. And when I think about some of the strongest and bravest people that I know, it's the people who are willing to ask for help, the people that realize that strength is not the silence of suffering and that needing support doesn't make you weak. It actually just makes you human. And then kind of just in closing, here are just a few somatic practices in particular that I can give you. So the first one is called yielding. Yielding is your body's ability to collapse into support. And when we talk about collapse, what we mean is that you're allowing the joints, the muscles, the fascia, the viscera, you're allowing everything to surrender, to release, to let go. And remember, we talked about that relaxation, right? And how at the root of it, relaxation is really about releasing. And so to be able to allow your body to go into a postural attitude of yielding means that you allow your body to disengage. You don't have to be on. You don't have to be muscled up. You don't have to be armored up and ready to go. You're giving yourself permission to yield. And so I want to do a quick yielding practice with you all here for just 2 minutes. Okay. I just want to show you how this feels in the body. So as you're sitting where you are now, I'll invite you to just start to take a moment and to just feel your sit bones underneath you. Just feeling into the weight of the body and where it comes into contact with the chair or the seat below. And now just notice how the large leg muscles, the hamstrings and the quadriceps, how they are released right now. How possibly they're not engaged, but disengaged as you sit in this seat. And if you find that they are engaged, then what you can do is you can gently just start to engage those muscles, just flexing and releasing. And that's what we call pandiculation. Now what we're going to do is we're going to feel into the calf muscles. Okay, if they feel like they're engaged, then we can just flex them and engage them for a moment and then release. And the same with the feet. Feeling into the feet. And if they feel engaged, then we can just tense the feet, bracing, curling the toes under, and then releasing. Now let's bring our awareness up to the hands for a moment. And just notice how the hands feel right now. Are they moving back and forth? Are you doing something with your hands? And if you are, is it possible for a moment to just allow your hands to disengage and to rest? And if that feels difficult to do, then what you can do is you can just clench your fists for just 1, 2, 3, and let go. Just notice any buzzing, any tingling in your fingers as they rest. And then just feel into the arms, feel into the elbows, feel into the biceps, triceps, up to the shoulder joints. Just notice how the arms feel. And if they feel engaged, can we just start to engage those muscles even more, flexing, bracing, and releasing. Notice how your breath might start to be shifting. Notice if it feels like it's more nourishing, more deep. And now we're just going to bring our awareness to the lower belly. Okay, down to that pelvic bowl and into the hips and up to the belly button. And here, can we just allow ourselves to just brace for a moment, right? Just pulling up that pelvic diaphragm and bracing the belly and then gently letting go. And there might be times when you start to release one area of the body and it feels like a bit of a domino effect, like a cascade. We call this a global response. It's body-wide. And now let's just focus on the rib cage, up to the chest, around the heart, up to the clavicle and the shoulder diaphragm, and even into the back muscles. And here we're just going to engage, right? Go ahead and brace this part of the body. You might even feel those shoulder blades coming together as the trapezius muscles pinch and then release. And now just feeling into the neck. Our neck does so much work for us. It is the keeper of our attention, the orchestrator of our attention, right? It holds us up and it connects our wonderful brain down to the body. So here, let's just go ahead and allow the neck to be tense for a moment. Engage, 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 and release. Now we're going to move to the head and the face. And here we're just going to kind of scrunch up the face for a moment, okay? And almost just feel like your fascia or the skin around the head is just being tightened towards the face. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and scrunch. Scrunch, scrunch, scrunch. And release. And then just notice from the bottom of the feet up through the legs, the knees, into those large leg muscles, through the hips. Just start to notice what it's like for your body to be yielded, for you to feel settled. You might notice that some emotions come up. You might notice that pain comes. And this is often what can happen when we begin to do this work, when we begin to slow down enough to meet our body where it's at in the moment. As we become more present and more embodied, we open ourselves up to not just what feels good, but also sometimes what doesn't feel good and what's been calling for our attention. Right, so this is just an exercise called yielding. And I walked you through a full yielding exercise, a full body map. In the Body First Healing program, we did a full 30-minute session on this. So of course you can go even deeper, but you can also just make this a micro practice, right? Maybe while you're driving in the car, is there an area of the body that you can yield a little bit more? As you're sitting in your chair at work, or as you're playing with the kids, or just resting or cuddling, can you just notice how it feels for the body to be yielding? Okay, so bring your conscious awareness to that. And so what we just practice as well is something called pendiculation, which is a rebound of tension and release. It's a tension and release cycle. So when we tense, when we stretch, right, we tense the body and then we let go. So you can do those through micro releases, okay? And then micro resourcing would be the third thing that you can practice. So far we've done yielding, we've done micro pendiculations, and you can also do micro resourcing, which is just leaning into things that feel good or have a feeling of betterness or okayness. So maybe it's self-touch, right? Maybe just hugging yourself. Maybe it's co-regulation. Maybe it's grounding. Maybe it's being out in nature. Again, these are the things that bring in some more of that wholeness. And these are the practices that deposit into your bank so that you have more of that capacity. All right, my friends. Well, I hope that you found this episode to be super supportive. I know that this was a bit of a different take on burnout, but I think it's important to look at it through a different lens, a lens that's not just focused on how the physical body feels, how the physiology is responding, but also our personal relationship to burnout, where that stems from, how it is influenced by our environment, by cultural conditioning. And by having all of these nuanced perspectives, it allows us, number one, to get curious around the way that we show up. Is this authentic, or is this just old patterning? And that is step number one, to really showing up in a way that feels aligned, in a way that feels like us. I often say, I don't want to waste time in my life living a life that doesn't feel like my own. So in summary, I hope that you've taken from the conversation today that burnout is not failure, it's wisdom, maybe even a blessing, and that it is a signal and not weakness. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Body First Healing podcast. If you found this episode to be supportive, please, please, please share. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes, even bonus episodes. And if you don't follow already, you can connect with me over at Heal with Britt, 2 T's on Instagram or TikTok. And finally, to learn more about joining me in my 6-month somatic healing container, the Body First Healing program, or buying my book, go to bodyfirsthealing.com. This has been an awesome conversation, you guys. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you again soon here on the Body First Healing podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into the Body First Healing podcast. If this episode resonated with you, I would be so grateful if you subscribed, left a review, or shared it with someone that you love. I'll see you back here next week, and until then, be gentle with yourself. You're doing the best you can with what you have, and that is more than enough. Just a quick note, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult a qualified provider for personal support.